My name is Elizabeth Williams. I am a member of the Glossy Black Conservancy in the Science and Research section, as well as an ecologist here with BAM Ecology with Adrian, who you should be familiar with from yesterday. Don't forget, just a bit of housekeeping, the same as yesterday. Please update your Zoom names if possible with your actual full name and also where you come from. And also, please don't forget to add any questions you have as we go through in the chat. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of our next three speakers, but we will also have a bit of a Q&A after the first section, just because Sarah has to depart early. So if you do have any questions for Sarah and her team, please, we'll answer those after the first seminar. So just a reminder that this session is about habitat mapping. So we've got three excellent talks happening today. We can go straight into, this session is about habitat mapping, which in turn informs policy, and we use that quite a little bit, and in planning and assessment processes. So in this session, we'll hear from people involved in habitat mapping in New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, about the strategy they use to compile data and prepare maps to drive conservation outcomes. So first up, we have the team from the Glossy Black-Cockatoo Food for the Future. And so we've got a bit of a few people will be talking in this session. So this presentation's Food for the Future, Mapping Potential Habitat in Northeastern New South Wales. And we have three speakers for this presentation. So we have Margaret Hall, who's the project manager, as well as Joanne Green, and also Professor Sarah Legge, who's a threatened species ecologist. So if you would like to get started, that would be great.
Okay, look, I'm Margaret. I'm here this morning with Jo Green to my left. We're in the Nightcap Range in northern New South Wales. Well, Sarah's over in Broome in Western Australia. Firstly, we'd just like to acknowledge our traditional owners. For Jo and myself, it's the Widjabul Waibul people, and for Sarah, it's the Yaru Nation, people of Rabibi or Broome. So thank you to them, and our respects to their elders past and present. Okay, the Food for the Future project. Obviously, this came out of the November 2019 bushfires that also came to the rainforest of the Nightcap Range. In the months following the fires, primarily Sarah noticed that there were glossies popping up in some unusual places. We do know that the glossies have got specialised diets, which means that they're susceptible to shortages of Alocasuarina seed. The Alocasuarinas are killed by severe fires, and that new recruits set seed after approximately 10 years. Okay, so we've got extensive fire, which we had in all up and down the east coast, but also in the Nightcap Range. Extensive fire brings prolonged food shortages, and then frequent fire will reduce food availability. So we had to think about this and thought, well, okay, we need to have a look at a few things. With fires increasing in severity and frequency, how can we mitigate the likely effects on the amount and continuity of Alocasuarina food supply? Okay, so we set three aims or desires to answer, questions to answer. Firstly, can we identify broad glossy habitat preferences in our region? How were these preferred habitats affected by the Black Summer fires? And finally, can we use the habitat preference information to identify potential re-veg areas that could support high quality food resources for glossies in the future? We looked at 6 local government areas in northeast New South Wales: Tweed, Byron, Ballina, Lismore, Kyogle and Richmond. This area, it's all south of the Queensland border, but it's almost entirely in the southeast Queensland bioregion, which is the green shading on that map. So I'm going to flick to Sarah now, who will take you through what we did.
Oh,
hang on, I'm having trouble. There we go. So I'm just going to run through each of the 3 aims that Margie put up and just tell you where we got to with them. So the first aim was whether we could identify some habitat preferences for glossies in our region. And many of you will know there's been quite a bit of effort to map glossy habitat in southeast Queensland, but much less so in northeast New South Wales. So what we did was pretty straightforward. We collated glossy sightings from the multiple data sources that we could find, and there's a list of them there on the slide. We also sourced the New South Wales state vegetation maps, and for all the vegetation types that were in our study region, we selected out the plant community types that have Allocasuarina in the upper or mid-story. Then we got hold of the New South Wales state soil group mapping, and we pulled out brown earths, yellow and red podzolics. Now, the reason we did that was that there's some work almost 30 years ago by Thomas and Patterson first, I believe, that showed there was some association between the glossy cockatoo sightings and podzolic soils in the Gold Coast region. And you can see in that map on the slide there does seem to be a clustering of observations on the red shading, which are the podzolic soils. So what we did is we intersected the veg mapping with the soil mapping, and then we attributed plant community types that had Allocasuarinas and these brown earths and podzolics as primary feeding habitat. And if there were vegetation types with Allocasuarinas but on other soils, we called that secondary feeding habitat, and everything else was just other. And then we had a look to see how things lined up. And so this is the resulting map. So on this map, we've got the primary feeding habitat in red, the secondary feeding habitat in orange, and then the glossy sightings overlaid on the top. And certainly it looks like glossy sightings tend to occur on those 2 habitat types. If we zoom into a couple of the clusters, like that one there on the top left, you can see that the sightings do look to be more common in the primary feeding habitat, or what we're calling primary. Let's look at another cluster. You see the same sort of pattern emerging. They do seem to be more common on this primary feeding habitat. We can look at this information quantitatively, of course, which is some simple statistics. So here we've got in this table the glossy sightings in the primary habitat, secondary habitat, and then other habitats. And given their area, we can convert that to a sighting density, and then just run some simple tests to see if those observations are deviating from expected. And certainly the sightings in the primary habitat were happening or occurring significantly more than expected. And there were significantly less sightings in the other habitat than expected, given their areas. So it's a pretty basic analysis, but it does suggest that plant community types with Allocasuarinas on these brown earths and podzolics are preferred by the glossy black-cockatoos. So presumably that's because they're better quality feeding areas. So that was the first aim. So then we wanted to find out, well, how have these feeding habitats been affected by the fires, given that we've seen glossies turning up in unusual places? Is it because the feeding habitat's been affected? So on this map, I've got the primary and secondary habitats once again, but now we've overlaid the fire severity mapping, the GBUM fire severity mapping, and we've shaded the low to moderate severity and the high to very high severity differently. So you can see there is a fair bit of overlap. We can turn that spatial data into some numbers, and about a third of what we're calling primary feeding habitat was burnt at high to very high severity. 17% of the secondary feeding habitat burnt severely, and overall 28% feeding habitat burnt severely. And of course, this will be conservative because some of the areas that burnt in moderate severity fires, the casuarinas in those areas would have been killed by those fires as well, but we haven't included them here just to be a bit on the safe side. So what does this mean? Well, obviously these burnt areas, pushing 30%, they're not going to be available to glossies to feed in for another well, 8 years now, I guess. And also any fires in the next decade or in the next 8 years in the rest of the area is going to further reduce the total available feeding habitat. So the fires, it does look like the fires had a significant impact. So then we started thinking about, well, how do we use this information to help cockies in the future? And we thought, there's a lot of re-veg in our area. Some of that re-veg could include allocasuarinas in the mix. Where should those places be? Where are the priority areas for including allocasuarinas in the planting mix? Now, obviously, in our region, the revegetation work, the focus of that work is driven by funding opportunities. And in our region, that's mostly about restoring koala habitat, rainforest areas, riparian areas, and also some dune care work. But, within that focus, you can still consider the needs of other species when you're selecting the planting mix. So just with modest changes to that mix, you might be able to help a broader range of species. So the question was, where in the landscape should we recommend including allocasuarinas in the planting mix? So what we did was, again, I think pretty straightforward. We honed in on cleared vegetation areas, because we're talking about revegetation projects, so we want areas that are now cleared. In those areas, we subsetted out the places with brown earths and podzolic soils. We chucked out any areas that were very small. And then we talked to some glossy experts about this project, and they all suggested that glossies were unlikely to use areas that are too far from places where they're already hanging out. So we then removed areas that were more than 10 k's from a known nest tree, and also removed areas that were more than 5 k's from existing or past glossy black-cockatoo sightings. And this is what we get left with, this map here. So again, it's got the primary and secondary glossy habitats, but now we've got this purple shading, which are what we think are the priority areas where allocasuarinas should be considered in the planting mix. I'll just show you one zoom up.
5 minutes left, Sarah.
Thanks. So here's a zoom up so you can see how these areas interdigitate with each other, and you can see that the purple's never too far away from the existing feeding habitat. So I'm going to hand over to Joe now, who'll just talk through how we've used that in a case study example. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, well, so we used the mapping tool, and we found a site in the Tweed, which was interesting because this site met all the criteria. It had red podzolic soils, it was cleared of vegetation, it's close to water, there was 2 large dams nearby that were over 1 hectare each, and it's north of Coogin Lake. And it's connected to other vegetation as well. So it's got potential nesting trees in Coogin Nature Reserve. There's a huge remnant to the north. So this, we looked at a reference community, as we do when we're choosing plantings. The reference community was wet chlorophyll, dominated by probably brush, box, bloodwood, tallowood, with Allocasuarina littoralis. So all of this worked really well together. And of course, we had that.
Oh, you've just gone on to mute. Could you unmute and continue on?
So the last thing I said was we had willing landowners, and the great landowners they're great landowners because they were prepared to give up several hectares and do this planting. So we got the funding. The funding was through in 2021. Of course, 2022 dawned on the Northern Rivers, and it rained and it rained and it rained and it rained. And we couldn't really get on the site until the end of 2022. Just noting that photo in the top of the screen there is, you can see the red podzolic soils. So it's what we're considering to be good quality land for glossies. So the plantings worked really well. And I'm just going to check this. We use wide-spaced planting with clusters and clumps of glossy trees close together. lot of the planning was done by conservation volunteers, and the follow-up's been done by the wonderful girls at Conservation Volunteers Australia. So another ingredient in success of a planting is to have a good NGO involved. A key point here is that there's other plantings across the site for koalas, for other species, but this is a multi-species planting. So this site's done really well, and you can see in those two photos that, like, from September 22 to 24, the trees are really well established now. What I'd really like to know is what the fungi's doing. I was really interested in Gabrielle Crowley's talk yesterday, talking about the fungi. I'm wondering what is happening in these new revegetation sites. Back to you.
Can you still hear us? Okay, I'm just going to very quickly leap through the next slides. What we did do on the basis of that map, we've actually put together a fact sheet which outlines why we've done this study. It's got a copy of the map in it. The maps that we've developed are available on the Byron Shire Council mapping portal for those that want to have a look at them. And the fact sheets that we've put together, basically we're trying to simplify. We want people to plant glossy food trees, basically, if they've got the right land, the right soils, and they're in the right places. We'd really like them to think about glossies in their plantings. And again, it's this mixed species thing. So the fact sheet includes some information on picking the planting site. It also includes some ideas on how you can plan your planting. Again, as Jo said, it's putting your Alocasuarinas clumped together so that the glossies can reduce overall foraging effort, things like that. Make sure that you've plant some eucalypts and see if you can plant a really good mixture of native species that are local to your area. We consider that a suitable ratio of Alocasuarina food trees to other native trees is 1 Alocasuarina to 10 others. Just in summary, we believe that the glossies do have habitat preferences in our region based on the Alocasuarinas on certain soils. We can use this to provide strategic guidelines to support local landholder plantings and revegetation decisions. We can mitigate future climate-driven fire impacts on feeding habitat and hopefully offset further fragmentation of feeding habitat from human population growth in our region as well. Revegetation projects, as we have said, are often funded in response to specific threatened species needs, but we can take these opportunities to think and act more broadly. And finally, mixed multi-fauna species plantings are already becoming more common in our region. We just want to see an escalation of that and just have people thinking that glossies, food trees will always be in the mix. So finally, a few people to thank working with this project. That's their names up there. And then just to give you an idea of what the fact sheet, the final fact sheet will look like, we'll just flash that up and then open up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dean. That is very, very interesting. And there's been quite a few questions come through that I'm hoping someone in your team can answer. So the first one from Danny was in relation to the records that you used to develop the mapping in terms of the sightings or the records. Was that just feeding records, or did that also include drinking and nesting and things like that?
It includes all records, so there'll be a mix. I think most of them would be feeding records because that's, or maybe, yeah, feeding records because that's when people commonly see cockatoos. There are not that many nesting records in our region. It's possible that they'd be drinking records, but I reckon the vast majority would be feeding records.
Excellent. And there was also quite a bit of discussion, but there is some answers being had in the chat relating to your choice for the soil types, and just how that relates to what was discussed yesterday by Gay in terms of the geology as well. So just to reiterate the questions for those that haven't been watching the chat, it. Sorry, I'm scrolling madly. So Brian asked, interested in how the red and yellow podzolic soils would fit into the geological categories Gay presented yesterday. And Gay did have a response saying that it should pretty well perfectly match between the priority areas and the preferred rocks. So is there anything you wanted to add to that, team, or Gay, if she wants to pop online and answer a little bit more detail?
Is that question to Gay?
Sarah, do you want to say something, or?
Yeah, so maybe open up to the team first. Sarah or Margaret and Joe, did you want to say anything before we move across to Gay?
So are you asking whether the soils match up to the geology?
Yes, if you know,
I'm going to leave that to Gay.
Okay, fair enough. Gay, did you want to jump in?
Can I share my screen? Hello. Is it possible to share my screen? Just show you a quick map, and anyone who can remember what map Sarah's shown will see that that's a pretty perfect match.
Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
Yep. So this is the project area that they've been talking about. And as you can see, this area that's been their priority is, well, the dark colour ones, because for people who didn't see it yesterday, the darker purple is the preferred rocks with Toyolosa, and the dark blue is the preferred rocks with probably still Toyolosa, but also Littoralis. And this is the preferred priority project area that they were talking about. Then there was a big swathe of secondary priority habitat, and then again these were high priority areas. So the soils that they're picking out are sitting on these non-calcareous sedimentary rocks.
Excellent. So it sounds like it's all matching up very well then. Anything else anyone else wanted to add on the geology soils question before we move on to another question? No, that's okay. Ask if there were any links to info that you can send to the group, but I'm not sure exactly what you mean links in terms of, in addition to the ones that I believe Margaret and Sarah popped up. If you want to jump on and chat, or jump and visually chat, the like verbally chat as well. Happy to just get a bit more clarification on that question. Fact sheets and that sort of thing. So I think at the end of the presentation there was there a few links and whatnot. Maybe we can make them available. Margaret and Sarah and Joe, that's okay?
Margie, you're muted, but maybe you answer that one. You're still muted.
Yeah. What is going on?
We can hear you now, Margaret.
Oh, can you? Oh, there we go. Yeah, look, we do have a fact sheet that's under production at the moment. As I said, the maps themselves are being available to anybody, aren't they, on Byron Shire Council's mapping portals. So anybody can jump online and have a look at those. Again, they're only for the 6 local government areas that we looked at. The fact sheets will be available both in hard copy and in digital form, and will be available to anybody. We haven't really decided. We can provide it when it's finished digitally to all land care groups, also to the Glossy Conservancy. Very happy for the Glossy Conservancy to have it, and then people can access your website if you would like them to take it from there. Yeah, so
I'll just add, the mapping is available through Byron Council at present, and we're hoping that the other councils will pick it up as well. And so it'll be really great if all the Northern Rivers councils can have that mapping available. Anyone that's interested could contact us and we could provide more details. So probably contact me and I can organise mapping if it's needed for a project.
the other thing we do have is a very high quality PDF version of it that we can provide in
Yeah,
some form, so that actually people who don't have the GIS platform can also look at this. I think conservation volunteers have a copy that I provided on a USB, and they downloaded that onto their computer. So we can send this information out in a number of ways. Okay.
And Sam's just mentioned that we might try and pop some of those on the Glossy Black Conservancy website as well, so that other people can have a look at any fact sheets or any information that people have. It's great to be able to actually share that sort of knowledge, including the fantastic information that you've found there. Is there any other questions for this team before we? Oh, Brian, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to, like, in my limited experience, it's often been the availability of potential planting sites that's driven where you revegetate rather than a schematic prioritization. So I'm just wondering how much you've had to actually use your prioritization. Do you have like an excess of available planting sites?
I'm sure there will be down in the south, in the Bunga area, especially in the fire zones. I think that's really important. Where the recovery wasn't good enough, there could be supplementary planting. That's not usually done, but it's something to think about. And in the Tweed, it's really interesting because there's been a lot of compensatory plantings in that area for the big King's Forest development that's going to go in there. It's almost one whole suburb going in and over time. And so it's really important that we prioritise that area to get good plantings in, because there's glossies in that area. It's only a couple of k's from the coast. And so it really links up with all the coastal vegetation as well. It is really important that this model doesn't cover the coastal sandy vegetation. It only covers the podzolics, but they're very close together, so it's very linked. And yeah, look, I think there's plenty of revegetation to do across other shires as well.
I might just make a point that on the final page of the 4-page fact sheet, we've actually given some planting suggestions, the types of plants that people could consider put in, depending on where they actually are in the area, where they're in the hinterland or on the coast. Now, they're specific to our region, but that could be taken and adapted by other areas. For example, if you wanted to follow the model and see what you can do for the Clarence Valley, it would be a simple matter of changing those out to a different plant mix. But I suppose at the heart of it, the idea of the fact sheet is people come, they have a bit of land. It's not necessarily enormous, but maybe it's a hectare, and they want to revegetate it. And we're trying to make it as easy as possible for them to include glossy cockatoos in their revegetation planting.
And there's just been a question, similar sort of thing in that, and Sarah's already answered in the chat, but for those not following along in the chat, just a question about whether the mapping that that was done by your team, whether it could be rolled out in other areas, and as long as there's some local botanical expertise in terms of what PCTs or maybe REs in Queensland, if we want to adapt it up here, but I'm sure Liz will have something to say about that shortly. As long as you have botanical expertise to know what PCTs, REs have got the feed species, food tree species, then yes, it should be able to be used in other locations as well. Any other questions? Otherwise, we might move on to the next one. But just a reminder that Sarah in particular won't be available for the Q&A at the end of this session. So if there is anything pressing, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, we will move on. That looks like it's it. Okay, so thank you so much, team, for presenting on that. That was actually really fascinating, and it's given me lots of ideas. Anyway, so we'll move on to the next session now, or the next talk, and we've got Liz Gould, who is also with the Glossy Black Conservancy. She'll actually be talking about our own conservancy habitat mapping for here in southeast Queensland. So just a bit of a background on Liz. Liz has worked in natural resource management for nearly 30 years, managing multidisciplinary teams to deliver large and small-scale collaborative projects. She's primarily focused on biodiversity conservation, including threatened species and ecosystems, wetlands, and connectivity conservation. Liz has been involved with the Glossy Black Conservancy for nearly 20 years, is a director with the Great Eastern Ranges, a member of the Gondwana Rainforest World Heritage Advisory Committee here in Queensland, and chair of the Colo Creek Catchment Group. That's a lot of things to do, Liz.
Yeah, it kind of keeps me busy. Thanks.
Okay,
I'm feeling a little.
Over to you.
You can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'll switch to my slide, but I'll tell you what, I'm feeling a little daunted by that amazing presentation I just heard. Wow, we've got a lot to do here in Queensland. I will just share the presentation if I can remember where I put the thing. There we go. Okay, we'll see that one. Okay, just changing to slideshow mode. Is that all good for everyone? Beautiful.
Yep, all good.
Thank you. So yeah, we've introduced, this is the Southeast Queensland mapping we did. So working with the Glossy Black Conservancy, and at the time I was working for ACQ Catchments, which is the regional NRM, was the regional organisation for Southeast Queensland, now known as Healthy Land and Water. And with Australian government funding, we initiated some habitat mapping for Glossy Black-Cockatoo, but also a suite of other species. It was prompted by a Queensland government back on track process, where we'd gone through across Queensland. I guess the Queensland government had identified a range of priority threatened species, which were then regionally prioritised based on issues happening in each of their what we call the NRM regions. So in New South Wales, it's similar to your local land services region. In Queensland, they're all non-government organisations, but based on the Australian government regional framework. So each region came up with a prioritised list, and then the key that came out, this is sort of the background driver to it all, is we came up with, all these threatened species are threatened by this is what we need to do. But the question was, where do we actually need to do this work? We just have a list of species without having target landscapes. So that was kind of the driver behind this, and glossies were one of the species of high priority for Southeast Queensland, and we went ahead with doing some mapping. A little bit different from the previous presentation in that we followed a Queensland government approved method for doing peer review, peer expert review and modelled habitat, with the aim of getting that mapping into our planning protection mechanisms. So the Queensland government has a series of approved methods. If you don't follow those methods, there's your mapping for threatened species habitat doesn't transfer into legislative protection. So I just have to frame it that way, because you'll see that what we did is similar, but not as deep as what you've just heard about, but it was done with the main purpose of getting habitat protected under the Queensland Vegetation Management Act and recognised as essential habitat. So similar to the presentation we just heard, we did an intersect of high precision records with the Queensland Herbarium's regional ecosystem mapping. We then undertook an expert review of the regional ecosystems, and we categorised habitat. And I'll go into all of those in a little bit more detail. So we used a variety of different data sources. So obviously at that point, so this mapping was developed, released, I should say, in 2016. But there's a few people in the room who were part of that process and know that it took about 3 years to get expert sign off on the rules that we use for the mapping. So we have to go back a little bit in terms of the data that we used to develop the process. So in 2010, the Glossy Black Conservancy developed an online portal. We used that, and there's a paper on the screen there. Guy Castley and I presented that, I think, back in 2015 at a citizen science conference. So again, underpinning the important role that citizen scientists have in collecting data. We used Glossy Black Conservancy's data. We used WildNet records. We used bird data. We filtered that information to make sure it was high precision records. So there was a time bound data, so it had to be post 1990. And we also made sure that it was high precision. So we had to drop a lot of records because the spatial accuracy, particularly for older records, just wasn't there. These days, we have amazing tools that allow us to, get our GPS locations down to 5 meters or even better. But some of the older records have a much looser precision accuracy. With the online data collected via the Conservancy, we also obviously had to do a lot of record validation. And for those who were in some of yesterday's sessions, there's a really important engagement and education process in all of that, and making sure that the sighting records that we're receiving were glossies, not yellowtails, or even red-tails in our region. We don't get as many of them, but they do pop in through there. We were also not just taking sighting records of birds and observations, but looking at the feed tree records. That was an important element to the Conservancy's online data pool, was collecting record on feed trees. Because again, I was very jealous of Brian's presentation yesterday, where he was telling us about hundreds of glossy black-cockatoos visiting waterholes in New South Wales. We're lucky to see 1 or 2 if we get out there, and that's over a course of 5 years. So finding feed trees becomes the next exciting thing to do. The Conservancy's data was available on a scalable mapping platform at the time, and that's how people contributed the data. We've moved that offline with the integration with bird data now. But we were able to use 1,900 records submitted through the Conservancy's portal. And as I said, we combined that with data from a couple of other sources to get our high precision records of glossies. And at the time, the regional ecosystem mapping was version 8, and I think we're up to version 13.1 now. So there's a substantial change in the mapping that's happened. So we are sort of taking a bit of a look back in time in a way with the process, but there's still some important, I think, learnings from this, and obviously from the presentation we just heard, there's a lot more we could do. So when it comes to habitats, they were basically, for glossies, split into foraging habitats and nesting habitats. So the foraging habitats were produced, as I mentioned before, they intersected those high precision data records with the regional ecosystem mapping. But then an intensive and extensive, I would say, expert elicitation process to work through those regional ecosystems to check that we weren't paying as much attention to records of glossies that were only flying over, but more attention to records when they're actually using those habitats, or there were those feed tree records, as I mentioned. We particularly identified there the regional ecosystems with the preferred food tree species, which there's 5 in our region. So we've got Littoralis and Torolosa, as mentioned before. We also have the thready-barked Sheoak, Inifloa, and we've got some Belar in our region as well, and obviously the coastal Sheoak, Equisetifolia. So 5 different predominant feed tree species. There are others that are known to use, but they weren't seen as being those that were the real drivers behind glossy's use of a particular regional ecosystem. So we removed the regional ecosystem considered unlikely to support those, and there were things we checked. So the Queensland Mehribarium has its regional ecosystem benchmark information. It has technical descriptions. So we poured through that to identify ecosystems with the preferred feed tree species in a reasonable percentage. I'm going to have to look up what that percentage was, but we also added, because we had a group of experts, so we had several members from the Glossy Black Conservancy, part of our expert panel, and I think we had 1 person outside of the Conservancy at the time, part of that panel. And there was a lot of discussion about regional ecosystems with known food tree species, which we didn't have data on. So again, using that expert elicitation process to identify those regional ecosystems in the absence of records of glossies. So those were added, and we ended up with a refined list of 54 foraging habitat regional ecosystems. And just while I was listening to that amazing presentation, I then thought, what land zones were they on? How does geology and soil type influence those? So I just did a quick analysis. So we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different land zones in Southeast Queensland bioregion. So it's not just the SEQ NRM region, but it's the entire bioregion north of the border. So there's 6 different land zones used by glossies. So to a lesser extent, the regional ecosystems in those coastal landscapes, land zones 2, and the tertiary quaternary landscapes in land zone 5. But you see there's a variety of different land zones used, so associated with most of the regional ecosystem. So it'd be really interesting to delve into that geology land zone. And again, to do probably a spatial extent analysis on this as well and compare it with more recent data. But I'm digressing a little bit. I'm just looking at all the things that we'd really like to take the mapping to for the next level. When we look at nesting habitats, though, we couldn't take a regional ecosystem approach given the diversity of, well, I guess not the diversity of tree species, but the fact that the tree use and hollow use by glossies isn't driven predominantly by a regional ecosystem, particularly a remnant vegetation element to the regional ecosystem. So I probably should have explained that before in case those don't know. So regional ecosystems are the vegetation types, but they're then separated into remnant or regrowth, or it's pre-clearing and the ecosystem doesn't occur. So the habitat modelling we were using was driven by a remnant vegetation approach rather than looking at regrowth and pre-clearing landscapes. But we do know that glossies feed in those regrowth and pre-clearing landscapes, and they nest in those as well. So for the nesting records, we had to take a buffered net point approach, which is basically applying a 1,000 metre buffer to high precision nesting records. Within that, the rules were that we would include all mapped, unmapped, remnant, regrowth, native vegetation that either contains those tree species capable of forming large hollows or provides a buffer to a nest site. So we were really trying to cover off on as much as we could in buffering a nesting site. And with those hollow bearing trees included any tree that had a DBH greater than 0.7 metres, whether it's a living or dead tree, because we know obviously glossies use both of those. So the mapping results are shown on screen. We've got a bit of a map there. And it was categorised. So this is applying the rules of the Queensland government process. We have to categorise into habitat. They've changed the categories these days, but this is how it was categorised back in 2016. So is it essential habitat or is it general habitat? So these categories you can see down the side here. EHK is essential habitat known, EHP, essential habitat possible, general habitat known, general habitat possible, with the G's there, and then the nesting overlay. So the expert panel went, actually, you know what, there is no general habitat. It's all essential habitat for glossies. If it's feeding habitat, it's essential category, and obviously nesting is essential habitat as well. We then defined the mapping into our mapping rules. I don't know if you see my little pointer going round and round on the screen there. So any regional ecosystems that were identified as a foraging habitat and within 500 metres to a high precision record, or remnant or regrowth native veg within 1,000 metres to a high precision nest record, were considered to have high confidence that it was used by glossy black-cockatoos as an essential habitat. And then you can see there the rules working out from that, basically based on distance and proximity to a high precision record, saying, well, if the further we get away from a high precision record, the less confident we are that that patch of country is being used by glossies. But if it's the same regional ecosystem, we know that there's a potential that it would be used, just nobody's gone there to look for birds or feed trees. So that's how the rules kind of worked in that space. Whereas the further we moved away from a high precision record, the less confident we were on habitat use, even though the ecosystems might be there. So essential habitat known is they intersected within 500 metres and between 500 metres and 2,500 metres. And then essential habitat possible was those a bit further. So we still got a reasonable, like a 2.5 kilometre buffer on our high precision records in terms of ecosystem use. And the importance in that is that where those intersects happen is not on a point base, but it meant that the entire polygon mapped under that regional ecosystem was then selected in this process. So we're seeing whole polygons, just selected. So you can see the map there. We've got all the different colors there. So the known high confidence habitat is that really dark purple, medium confidence in the light purple, possible high confidence in the EHP is in the two different, so essential habitat possible is in two shades of green, with the darker green high confidence and the lighter green, the lower confidence in C. So if you look through there, there's actually quite a lot of the SEQ bioregion in Queensland that's mapped as essential habitat, either possible or known in that space.
Liz,
And
2
then, of
minutes
course,
left.
lovely. And then there's the nesting records stuff as well. Let me just scoot through. Yep, I put those categories up there. I should have brought that earlier. So how are we using that mapping? And I think that's an important learning and application of this. So whilst it doesn't have maybe some of the depth, and we could certainly do with updating it and applying a little bit more knowledge, because this was done in 2016. It is used for those environmental assessments and MSES. So when an environmental consultant has to do an environmental assessment report, they jump on the state government website, they have to do an MSES report. Glossy habitat is modelled, it'll show up, it'll tell you that it's in that area. So it's really critical because it feeds through into that development, assessment and approvals process. A quick analysis, not to the level of detail that, again, our New South Wales colleagues did on the impact of the 2019-2025 wildfires, because we only looked at extent. But of the mapping that we have, that we showed just on the screen just before, 56,500 hectares was mapped as glossy habitat, was within the 2019-2020 wildfire footprint. So that's pretty huge. It doesn't show what the depth of impact was with a high intensity fire and what level. It's just showing the footprint. That was the extent in the footprint. We used the mapping to provide some feedback in the review of the Shaping SEQ. That's the Statutory Regional Plan for South East Queensland review. That revealed that within the existing plan, there's just under 19,000 hectares of glossy habitat within the urban footprint, which means that's designated for clearing for development. There's just under 4,000 hectares within the rural living area. So again, could be subject to land use changes, but those are important landscapes to work with landholders on in terms of how they manage those. The proposed changes were introducing another 100 plus hectares into urban footprint. But the scale of mapping made it hard to do a more difficult analysis. And because of the layered approach that, I should have gone back a slide, just 2 seconds. So, sorry, these areas that are coloured are what's considered core habitat. It's those two that went through into the Veg Management Act declaration of essential habitat. These other categories didn't move forward. So that's important that only those two went through into essential habitat under Veg Management Act. The rest of the categories, though, the Conservancy's made available to its partners, which were most of the local governments in South East Queensland and quite a few others, to guide research and survey. So they're basically saying these are landscapes that we need to learn more about, with the idea when this mapping was developed that we would review and update it every 5 years. It's been used for fire management planning. That picture on the right is a project I'm working on with BirdLife, the Conservancy and Wildlife Queensland and Healthy Land and Water, talking about how we manage fire out in the Emu Vale area, and that mapping has informed both the surveys that Mike has undertaken in that space, but also will feed into the fire management planning. And obviously, it's been used by local government planning and extension support, such as in the Land for Wildlife program. Quickly on some constraints. As I mentioned, the regional ecosystem mapping is remnant vegetation. We've not applied this to regrowth, although I think that the Queensland government has a means of doing that. It just hasn't gone through into the Vegetation Management Act. It's dependent on the regional ecosystem mapping accuracy and scale at the time. This was version 8. It's been refined. The Conservancy and Healthy Land and Water neither have had the capacity to undertake the repeat analysis. So this mapping is outdated, 2016. At the time, we had limited nesting records, but I know there's been a lot more work by Daniela and Mike to increase our knowledge on nesting in the region, and that would be really useful to bring that in. It would be also useful to sort of integrate some of that knowledge on, well, what we heard this morning, soils mapping. Does that change where we consider to be more confidence in some of those identified habitats? But maybe habitats with mature forests, such as been done by Pat Norman and Brendan Mackey recently. And can we identify and categorise habitats based on the presence of mature forests, therefore more mature trees, therefore more nesting opportunity? And I pinched Save Sunrise, if they're online, I pinched that from an ABC article just to illustrate that if it's not mapped, then yeah, it's really hard to protect it. And I know some of the approvals for that area took place well before our mapping was developed anyway. We do have, as Ellie mentioned for a few who are online earlier today, a grant application in the system, hoping to hear the outcome really soon, which will give us the opportunity to review and update that mapping process. Yeah, thanks all. The taxon profile is available from ResearchGate. You can search for it and find it there. The habitat mapping is available from Q Spatial via the Queensland Government, as well as through the Glossy Black Conservancy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Liz. We've got time for maybe one or two questions, and there have been a few that have popped up, but I think that last slide has probably answered some of it. Liz, can you check that slide back up or pop the details for where we can get mapping into, and including the Q Spatial stuff and the ResearchGate stuff just in the chat? I think will help. Save Sunrise Glossy's mentioned that they'd like to have a look at the mapping in closer detail. I definitely want to have a look closer as well. So that would be great. Louise Crisp has asked, do you mean that 18,000 hectares of mapped glossy essential habitat in the urban development zone will be cleared despite being critical habitat?
It means that that habitat is in the urban. Will it be cleared? That's not for me to say. That's actually Queensland Government makes that determination. So it means that it's there. There's that potential for a huge level of impact, which is why the Conservancy wrote with the Shaping SEQ, basically saying there's already, you know, a vast area of habitat within the urban footprint zone. We didn't want to see any increase in that. And obviously that's got to be managed really carefully. I think we do need to be very vigilant on making sure that the Queensland Government looks at that mapping carefully, and again allowing more people access to it, communicating, which is what the point of today is, to say this mapping's there, how do we use it, how do we advocate for it? The government has access to it, it needs to be updated, we're really conscious it's out of date, but how can we really use it? There's certainly a role for advocacy there. There's a role for rehabilitation. There's a role for extension programs. So there's a whole means of application of that data. It's just getting it out there and making it available. So not necessarily will all be cleared, but it'd be hard to think that there weren't going to be any impacts there, Louise.
All right, we might move on, but Liz, you should check out the chat because you're getting lots of love in there. So please do that, and please upload those couple of areas where we can get some more resources, please. Okay, we might move on to our next speaker. So the next talk is on Sheoak habitat and recovery mapping in East Gippsland in Victoria, and this will be presented by Belinda Rossack. Sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, Belinda. I should just say Belinda, really. Who is the landscape evaluator for the Victorian Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, also known as DECA, I hope, because I'm going to use that in a second. So in terms of Belinda's bio, Belinda has always been interested in environmental management, studying a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resource Management in Adelaide, with her early career involving spatial data development and programming to create vegetation maps. She has worked for DECA in Gippsland for over 20 years in the areas of GIS, wetlands and threatened flora and fauna projects. The last 5 years, she has been looking at the impact of fuel reduction burning on species and communities through the MER program, which is the Monitoring, Evaluation and Reporting program, including the Glossy Black-Cockatoo. Belinda initiated the Sheoak mapping project in 2019 as a way to address ineffective mitigation measures and has worked closely with Deb Sullivan from BirdLife to design the survey method, collect data and develop management outcomes for glossies in East Gippsland. So we'll just move straight on to Belinda. Welcome and take it away.
Thank you very much, everyone. Okay, so I was trying to be clever and set up my second screen today so that I can actually see my notes, but it appears that I can't now. Can you see my notes there?
No, we can't see your notes.
No. Okay, no worries. I'll just move ahead without them. So apologies if I miss a few things, but so yes, I work as landscape evaluator, and part of my role is to manage the MER program for Gippsland. And most of the work I do is focused on monitoring the impacts of the planned burn program on a range of values. We've got half a dozen projects underway as part of the MER program. Some of them funded and some of them not, and the Glossies gets variably funded over the years. Probably the last couple of years we've had a bit of investment in it, which has been great. Just a quick acknowledgement to country. I'm joining you today from Gunai-Kurnai country. And I feel very privileged to actually spend a bit of time out amongst the Sheoaks and the Glossies. And it took me a couple of years before I saw my first Glossie, so I feel the pain of a few people out there. I didn't think I'd actually ever see them. So we've got few and far between. And you know, they always see you before you see them. So the mitigation review process, the MER program is about making sure we do what we say we're going to do. So I do have my notes here. So are we protecting the values that we've identified during the planning process? That's part of the MER program. The mitigation reviews is about the evaluation of mitigation measures for fuel management program. So that's looking at, are the mitigation measures implemented and are they effective? And if they're not implemented, then where's the process falling over? So is it during the planning process or is it during the operations process? And if the mitigations are not effective, then how do we improve them to create better outcomes for any of the species we look at? Particularly for, of course, for this, the Glossies, the mitigation measure that we had originally in our risk register for values, the mitigation measure for Glossies was turned out to be inadequate in terms of having a strong enough outcome for what burn planners need to do when they come across the values, but also about having an absence of spatial data to help decision makers. So that's where we really fell over in the process with this. So of course it's an adaptive learning and adaptive management process. The more we learn about Glossies, the more we can influence decision making and outcomes. Improving Sheoak protection during planned burning. That's my main goal as part of this project. So initially the mitigation review that I did for one of our burns in 2019 showed that Sheoaks were not protected as intended by the mitigation measures. So the process fell over at both the planning and the operational stage. The mitigation measure was not strong enough, and we had that lack of spatial data to be able to hand over to the burn planners or to the operational tactical planners to implement some measures in the field that were effective for the Glossies and protecting the Sheoaks. We have had, you know, in the past, we've got different people in different areas of the region. East Gippsland's very large. We've got two main districts. We've had some people that are very aware of the Glossies over the years and their association with the Sheoaks and dependency on the Sheoaks. So we've had some good outcomes in scattered areas across the landscape. So the aim was to create spatial data that gives burn planners that more of a landscape view of where sheoaks are and how to better manage those. So the mitigation review in 2019, I was working closely with Deb Sullivan from BirdLife, and we realised that to be able to make, to create spatial layers that help burn planners, we actually had to get out there on the ground and start mapping, because we looked at the vegetation classes that we have and to try and tease out where the Alocasuarina was within. So we have black sheoak that dominates down here, where they were within the EVC, the vegetation class mapping. They're scattered across a few different vegetation classes, but predominantly in the lowland forest. And lowland forest as a vegetation class is huge. Also noticed that as we walk through a lot of those areas, that lowland forest is quite, like, it's got quite a lot of subunits within that broader vegetation class that wasn't represented on any mapping that we had. So it was really difficult. We have a lot of, initially when we started this project, we didn't actually realise how much sheoak was out there. So there's a lot. And as we all know, not all sheoaks are equal when it comes to importance for glossies. So Deb and I got together with a group of BirdLife East Gippsland volunteers and some local experts to talk about what are some of the questions we need to ask when we're out there mapping. And we developed a project within Survey 123. So we had a spatial data capture tool that we could use. It gave us point information, and there's a few, there's a bit of a summary around why we use point information and how we can expand the point information to landscape level mapping. And there's a bit of history there with some of the rules around, or some of the guidelines in forestry industry, which we used as a basis for defining like a rapid assessment process. The intention was to have a lot of volunteers help us out with the mapping, and so we wanted to make sure it was an easy, streamlined approach where you didn't have to spend too much time out in the field. That tool was developed, and Deb and I started collecting data around the Cahoon Forest, and sorry, it's, it doesn't mean anything to anyone here, in a smaller area that had a lot of intensity burn planning associated with it. And then BirdLife East Gippsland group started collecting data around Mallacoota in 2019 in November, and they collected our first lot of consolidated data for that area before the bushfires came through. The top map, top screenshot is habitat distribution mapping. So we use that to help guide where we should start looking for sheoaks to map. The HDM is based on predominantly based on lowland forest outcomes, which like I said earlier, is quite vast and doesn't really pinpoint some areas. You can start to see some of the deeper areas, deeper brown areas that do align with where our data has been captured so far. So the points on the second screenshot below are all the point data that we've collected through the app since 2019. It doesn't look like a lot there, but there is a lot. So just some stats about that. Since 2019, we've searched around 15,000 hectares for sheoak. We've mapped 2,500 hectares of sheoak within that searched area. We've got about 2,500 sheoak records, and 41% of those sheoak records are feed tree records. Also, the points where we've collected information are kind of evenly distributed across like low to medium severity classes in terms of past fire, as well as long unburnt areas. How we map. So we tried a few different ways. I looked at remote sensing, a large landscape. I was trying to capture sheoak at a landscape level. And so I spoke to a few people who are experts in remote sensing to try and see how we can do this in a fast, easy way, because we actually didn't have any money at the time to do any mapping. So RMIT and Digital Twin Victoria talked about a process to do some remote sense mapping, and we found out that it was nearly impossible to do. We're in dense forest in East Gippsland with greater than 70% canopy cover. It makes it really difficult to get sub-canopy species mapped at a broad scale. We also looked at drones and high resolution images from drone imagery. Yes, it became too expensive. And also, you know, as we all know, the most important part in capturing extensive sheoaks is the feed trees. So in terms of our burn planning protocols and the framework that I work within, having evidence about the importance of a site for the glossies is about where their feed trees are. And that gives me, knowing the feed tree areas and extents gives me much more leverage over influencing burn plan outcomes. So, of course, boots on the ground is the way to go to get that feed tree information. And because I'm working within like I said, a burn plan framework, I work on burn units. So that's how I divided the landscape up initially by the burn units, and then subdivided that by search areas, which is based on contours, roads and hydro layers. And the reason I did that is because when I send people out in the field to do mapping, I want to make sure that all parts of the landscape that we're searching has been mapped adequately. So if we've got a group of 12 people and six groups of people, I can send them all to different search units by number, and we're not overlapping where we search, and we know that by tracking their searches, we know that we're getting good coverage over those areas. There's parts of the landscape that just by being out there, we know that you don't get sheoak in. How am I going for time? You don't get sheoak in, so things like steeper gullies where Banksia serrata and tegrifolia become more dominant, the sheoaks drop out. So we've tried to exclude those areas from the search areas, so that we're trying to, you know, save on time and money, people being out there. What we collect.
Belinda, about 5 minutes to go.
Okay, thank you. I'll speak faster. So we've got an unstructured and a structured approach, both using the same survey tool, and we look at questions like the extent of the sheoak patch, the sex ratio of sheoaks, recruitment, evidence of fire, dead and senescence, AUK classes, and a few others there that you can have a look through at another time. So the unstructured one is volunteers collecting information about where sheoaks are, and that helps guide us about into areas that we need to go and look. So when I send teams out, so we have volunteers go out through BirdLife East Gippsland occasionally, and a few other interested people. Deb's out there all the time as well, and I have district staff that help out with this. So this is what we get. We've developed guidelines for the survey approach. Any birds that we capture on imagery, any photos or videos we send to Deb to be reviewed as part of her Glossy ID project. We track everywhere that people search, and we collect point data, which we turn into Polygon Sheoak habitat data. I send a summary to all the district staff so they know what's been done and when, and it gives a bit of ownership over the people that actually go out there and do some of this work, that they can see the outcomes of some of their hard work. We present the data in a web map, as well as spatial overlays for burn planners to include as part of their planning process, and values overlay checking as part of the burn planning process. When we've got sheoak map, we've got the sheoak polygons, we've got the feed tree information, we combine those and create areas that are prioritised for protection. And that depends, there's a few rules around that on the number of feed trees within a site, the contiguity of the area, and proximity to nest sites. Those prioritised areas go into operational consideration during burn planning, and protection measures are discussed and agreed at a regional level. If we can't come to an agreement, then that's escalated to our Deputy Chief Fire Officer, who makes the final call on how we protect these areas. So ultimately, there's two outcomes. We exclude Sheoaks from burning through hand trails, raco, dozer lines, mulching lines, or we modify burning under Sheoak, maintaining as much as possible ground level fire. We introduce late winter burning, and the ignition timing is also critical. Another project that we do have funding for this year is Sheoak recovery in bushfire affected areas. And this is about looking at the first map I showed you with all the dots. There's a large gap in between there that we don't know that we've got. We don't know where the Sheoak are in there. We don't know if there's been feeding in there. It's remote, not as accessible as some of our other areas, and quite a distance to get to. So this project is going to focus on those areas which were impacted by the 1920 bushfires. A majority of the area was high severity burnt. So we're looking at what is the recovery potential of that area so we've got sites within high severity and then low severity, and then our control sites which have a 10-year and a 20-year gap. So we've set that up. Data hasn't been collected yet. We're only at the first stages of the project. There's all that information there, that we're collecting. And I'd just like to point out that, excuse me, horseshoe fungus is something that's come up as something of interest, identified by a private landholder in Mallacoota as something that is causing not dieback but collapse of some of the Sheoaks, and it's become, I want to say, more prevalent in the areas that we're looking, but I think it's just because we're looking for it more now. We're noticing it has an impact on the quality of the Sheoak habitat.
Belinda, 2 minutes.
2 minutes, thank you. A couple of projects that I'm running that are non-funded, and it's really about, after we've prioritised where we want to protect, and there's areas of Sheoak that still will be burnt as part of the burn planning, because they're in places like APZ, Asset Protection Zone, for reducing fuel levels for protection to life and property. Those areas that will be burnt anyway, I've set up trials that look at the impact of fire severity on cone opening. So we count the red and green cones at 3 different height classes, and count the opening of cones before, like what cones are open before and after the burn's gone through. And the same theory for the juvenile survivorship. So we're looking at what size classes that fire and the different severities within a burn, like a controlled burn, impact the survivorship of juvenile Sheoaks. Very preliminary data at the moment, so there's a long way to go with that one. And just very quickly, a lot of people have helped out with this, even though it's hard to get people on board because everyone's so busy doing their own thing. But definitely the project initiated with Deb Sullivan there with the GPS down in the bottom corner. Deb, if you're online, hi and thank you. And all your amazing work with Peter Morell and Roger Bilney as well in terms of the Flossy ID stuff. It's just amazing. So district staff have been great. We've done a lot, but we have a lot to go as well. And just quickly, in terms of, so some amazing speakers already, in terms of the soils and the geology stuff, I was wondering some of those questions that you previously answered about the non-calcareous sedimentary and how that relates to the soil type. So I've started to look at the soil types, and the work of the previous speakers about the podzolics. I would definitely look into a bit more now. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you listening. Happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Belinda. There's been a few questions come in on the chat. Being distracted by what's going on in my background. One of the questions. Okay. One of the some of the questions have been revolving around, and this is for Belinda, horseshoe fungus. So can you just quickly, someone was asking, is it a type of bracket fungi? Does it attack particular species of sheoaks? Could you give any more information on that, Belinda?
A little bit of information. I don't know a lot. I have spoken to the Royal Botanic Gardens about this as well. So I think I had a picture of it there, but it's gone now. So wherever it, and we're mostly black sheoaks here, so that's what we've been finding it on. Wherever it attaches to the sheoak, it generally, and I haven't started taking measurements or anything or collecting data, but about a metre above the fungus, and they're usually quite large, the large bracket fungus. Usually about a metre above where the fungus is, the tree snaps off. So the tree eventually dies, but you lose the canopy of it in even before it's completely dead. And that was something, landholder had noticed on his property, and then we started looking around a bit more and started to notice a lot more in the sheoak areas across the whole extent, really, from Bairnsdale to Mallacoota. So we've been watching it. Some areas where there is a lot of it have been really long unburnt areas. We don't have a lot of those around, but there are a few. And it seems to have decreased the health of the entire sheoak stand within that area, but still a lot unknown.
Another question directly for you, Belinda, before we open it up to the rest of our speakers this morning. Lauren asked, can you please share your guidelines in terms of the collection? I assume that means, Lauren?
Survey guidelines. Yep. Happy
Yeah,
to do
just your
that.
survey guidelines would be awesome. It's a really interesting project. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Excellent. So anyone wants to ask any questions for the group as a whole who have been talking this morning, please pop in the chat. Something that was discussed a little bit earlier that I'll bring up while hopefully some of those questions are coming through is relating to glossies, and this is a bit of a general question, so please anyone chip in. Glossy's being seen in young trees, like what sort of age bracket are glossies seen in very young trees, I think was the question. It's a long way up in the chat that I'm currently scrolling through. And also, is there any capacity to translocate Alocasuarinas, which I haven't heard about before, but if anyone knows anything about that, that would be great. The question was about if glossies feed from planted trees, and there was some talk about plantings from 4 years post-fire, usually 5 to 10 years, etc., etc. So if there's anyone else that wants to contribute to either of those questions, please either pop it in the chat or unmute yourself and have a bit of a discussion. Otherwise, please, if there are any other questions for the group this morning.
While we wait for any other questions to come in, I just wanted to say that there's been a request for sharing contact details of participants. So we'll actually set up a Google Sheet. We can't just share everyone's contacts, but we'll set up a Google Sheet and people can voluntarily go in and whack their contact details there, and then we'll share with everyone who has done that. So we'll find a way to do that over the next couple of days. Thanks for the idea, Kelly.
I'll just make a comment. Like, there's so much we're learning from everybody. Our interest, I guess, is being focused in southeast Queensland with the Glossy Black Conservancy, but hearing what's happening in New South Wales and Victoria now, and how do we bring all of that information so we can just update and upgrade our knowledge about glossies and get that better conservation outcome, whether it's in the planning mechanisms and the decisions development decisions, or whether it's supporting landholders. So I think it's awesome. Give the Conservancy a pat on the back, I guess, just bringing together all this information and knowledge so that we do have that opportunity. So there's just so much here to unpack.
Absolutely, and I'm pretty keen, Liz, to like extend on what we've done here in SEQ, just because I see glossies outside of the SEQ bioregion, and I'm like, I'd love to have the mapping done elsewhere as well. So this has been a great session just for bringing together what other states are doing as well, just to see how it all sort of correlates and how it differs and what we can potentially include as well.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Belinda. We all work with fire practitioners, and you seem like you've really brought everyone into the sort of fold really well and got them to be really excited about glossies and about glossy habitat. Have you got any sort of tips about how to engage, RFS or, park quarries and bring everyone together? And also in terms of legislation, like we sort of have this, the threatened species flora and fauna list, and there's parameters around how you sort of protect them within the fire, but within fire or hazard reduction burns. But it's sort of very general and is really hard in large sort of habitat areas. Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts about that as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no worries, Lauren. I'm glad you popped up because I didn't know who was talking. Nice to meet you. So the first part, it's been really hard actually to, it's been hard to bring people together within the department. So it's taken a long time to try and influence outcomes for glossies, for Sheoak protection. Yeah, I guess legislatively we don't have any broad frameworks that allow some of this habitat mapping to go into what I saw earlier. I think for Queensland was some of that protection area mapping that is legislated. So we've got more regionally focused frameworks and decision-making processes that the data goes into, but at a statewide level, not for this. We've got important protection areas that include important habitat, and I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done around getting it to that point. Only because, and possibly because the extent of the glossy habitat is restricted to East Gippsland. It's not a statewide distribution. So that may be why, but there is a lot more work I need to be doing with the state biodiversity team to actually try and embed it in some more decision-making frameworks. In terms of connecting with other people, so Deb has been amazing right from the start and getting information together and other people together through the BirdLife East Gippsland group as well. In the initial stages, I knew nothing about glossies in 2019. And I'm still learning a lot today about them through all the talks that everyone has presented. But yeah, it's difficult. So especially when you're in a department within a planned burning program, and the perception of what you do and what you don't do is really quite, they're extremes of what people perceive. So it's really hard to get people to understand that you're doing the best you can with what you've got, and that we're not, we're trying to improve species protection, from within. So yeah, I think there's a lot more I need to be doing with people like the CFA, and we don't do anything with councils at the moment. So my focus has been totally state forest based. But yeah, I think there's opportunity to broaden that.
Deb had her hand up before as well. Deb, did you want to contribute anything or ask a question?
Yeah, I was just going to just say congratulations to Belinda, actually, because without most of you knowing the area, Belinda has an enormous scale of landscape to work in, and she's basically doing it on her own single-handedly within the department. She developed the idea prior to any funding that was available, took the chance of running with it, and heavens knows the tears and hard work that she's put into it is absolutely extraordinary. So huge kudos to you, Belinda, because it's a really hard landscape to work in when you're working for people that do the burning as well as people that do the protecting. So congratulations to you. I just really wanted to make a point that everybody was aware she's doing this single-handedly, and she's bringing people together at a massive level. So kudos to you, B.
Thanks, Deb. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Belinda. Gay, did you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I was just responding to something that was in the chat. So I've been asked if I can provide the mapping of the preferred geological units for New South Wales, and if the Conservancy or someone wants to set up a share website Dropbox or something, I'd be quite happy to load it up there for people to use it. And if anyone in Queensland and Victoria wants to get access to similar mapping, I'd be really happy to help with that. I haven't done it, but I can help classify the geology, and particularly if it's over a project area, it wouldn't take long.
Excellent. I will leave that to Sam and Ellie to talk and think about. Another question has come through as well from Louise Crisps, just asking if the presenters think that planned burns in glossy habitat should be referred to the Commonwealth under EPBC Act to ensure protection.
I just added a comment on that one. I think that if a planned burn is done in accordance with the, approved ecological burn methods, restoring the ecosystem, best practice methods, there shouldn't be a significant impact on glossy habitat. But repeated burns, high frequency burns, particularly those that are aimed at property protection, might have an impact. And I don't know how you balance life and property with ecological. So, you've got people in landscapes who need to protect their property and their livelihoods, and they're going to be undertaking more frequent burns in their landscapes to remove fuel hazard, protect them. And that's going to be to the detriment of glossies. You're going to lose your old trees, you're going to lose your sheoaks in those landscapes. But it shouldn't be happening in our conservation spaces. It shouldn't be happening outside of life and property protection management. So done right, no, a referral wouldn't be needed. But if we're not raking around nest trees, if we're not managing burns, so you're allowing for sheoak regeneration, then that's a major concern. But Belinda's the expert here. That's just me off the top of my head.
I wonder if it also comes just because someone in the chat also mentioned that any fire tends to wipe out foraging habitat where they are. So I wonder if that's where that question is sort of coming from.
I think a lot of reading that I was doing before, and I had spoken to Kalia Barris from KI, that any fire was causing cone opening, so you lose your food source. So that's why I set up some of these trials, and the trials are happening in areas that are already designated for burning and already agreed low intensity burning. And that was to try and figure out if low intensity fire was having an impact. So like I said, it's early days, but some of the data is suggesting that juvenile survivorship is okay once you get past a certain age class or size class. And sheoak cone opening, if you've got low intensity burning it and you're getting minimal scorch to the canopy, even the radiant heat will open some of the cones at the lower level, but mid to high canopy, I wasn't getting any cone opening. But that's only, with 300 data points at the moment, so it's a very small data set. So I really hope to continue that work and get some information out of it. But, if we've got any PhD people out there that want to do some, I have to keep reminding myself that I'm not a researcher, like a yeah, I'm not doing PhD research or anything like that. So I've got to keep it to, operational outcomes for us. But yeah, if there's someone out there who's interested.
Well, I think
There
just
seems to
looking at the follow-up questions that have come there is also, I think this is one where the EPBC Act reforms, we're really reliant on those, because at the moment EPBC Act doesn't look at cumulative impact, and that's what we're talking about. So ideally, a small patch of burning here, loss of food trees there in the landscape for glossies shouldn't be an issue if that's not happening everywhere, and we're not seeing that overall decline in habitat across the huge landscapes that they need to survive. So EPBC Act referral is probably going to go, it's not a significant impact, because it doesn't have the capacity to deal with the cumulative impact. And I guess the whole bushfire response was aimed at, this is a species that from Victoria to southeast Queensland had massive impacts of the wildfire. It's huge landscapes got impacted, and that triggered that emergency response funding. But where do we go to once that emergency response funding has declined? How do we continue managing across these huge landscapes for the connectivity issues, for the foraging habitat extent, and the preservation of sufficient big old trees in the landscape to allow hollows? That takes a lot of effort, and EPBC Act does not have a solution for that at the moment.
There does seem to be quite a lot of chat about fire and fire planning. We're actually out of time and over time already. So I don't know, Sam or Ellie, if we can park this as a particular topic of interest that we may want to bring up at I don't know whether it's another time during the symposium or at a later date, but there is, quite a bit of chatter going on about it, and it does seem to involve all states as well.
Well, there will be opportunities to continue conversations, but also another shout out for completing the evaluation form, and I've popped the link in the chat, because in there is an option to tell us if we missed anything. We won't take that as criticism, but for example, convening another workshop or forum specifically talking about fire could be something that we do in coming months. So we just need a prompt. So either someone emails us and says, hey, you should do this, or pop it in the evaluation form, and one of us will follow up for sure. And I'll pop that link back in the chat. And thank you, Liz, for the awesome facilitation.